Thanks for tuning in. You're listening to Gnostic Studies. And this evening we'd like to do a lecture. It'll be the last lecture of 2021. Going to be studying the 6th class of Intermediate Gnostic Psychology. We studied the influences, impressions. Then we talked about the 3 brains and self-observation. And now we're going into each of the 3 brains. So we'll talk 2 classes about the mind, one about emotions, one about habits and actions related with the motor and instinctive centers. And in the end, we'll talk about the sexual center. So we thank you for joining us. We want to ask that if you have any questions, please submit them in the comment area. And before we get into today's class, we'd like to do a little review of the previous class. So let's look back at that material. We said that there were different fields of self-observation. Observation of the human machine, related with the 3 brains, and then observation of the personality and its mechanical reactions. And in order to develop those fields, that's why we're looking at the 3 brains in general, the personality we've talked about, but we wanted to see that actually the influences and the impressions from the previous 4 classes, all the classes in this series prior to this class, number 5 on self-observation that we're reviewing right now, were to prepare us for understanding the personality in this context of self-observation. When we begin to observe ourselves, we want to refer our data, what we receive, the observations that we have, to a category. Either it's a thought in the intellectual center, it is an emotion, a feeling, it's a sensation, or a movement, or something related with the instinctive center, or a sexual sensation. But we need to start by categorizing the things that we observe inside ourselves, because we have to be like a scientist, gathering data. And we can't just put it in the categories wherever. We have to know what it belongs to. So we defined in the introductory series the way to understand intellect versus emotion, emotion versus motor, motor versus instinct, instinct versus sex. We define that information if it's unclear to you. So that can be reviewed. But for now, if we can't determine what category the thing that we observe belongs to, then we don't put it in any category. Later on, maybe we can recategorize it, but for now, we just categorize the things that we're sure about. Next, we said that when you're observing yourself, there's really 2 methods of self-study: registering or recording. Recording within ourselves what we observe at a given moment. I observed that I started to get angry when this person said this or when they did this, as an example. So that's just recording. What happened? Well, I started to get irritable. I wanted to say something. Something in me wanted to speak. What is it that we observed? But that would be just recording what we observed internally. That's one method, registering or recording, and the second is analysis or attempt at analysis. So this is when we say, well, why did that happen? Why did I get angry? Why did that bother me? Why did I allow myself to get possessed by that ego? Why did I think that was okay to allow that ego to express itself through me, etc.? But one thing that's important to distinguish here is that once we begin to analyze, we lose the thread of self-observation, we lose the thread of recording, because we're just analyzing. So we need to differentiate between these two methods of self-study so that we can know that if we're self-observing, actually we're not analyzing yet. We're just observing. We're gathering data. Later on, during meditation, we can analyze, or during a time when we're not caught up in the particular situation, then we can analyze. But when we analyze, when we begin our analysis, we end up losing the thread of self-observation. So they can't occur at the same time. Then we talked about the division of functions, differentiating and assigning to the different categories, the things that we observed. Is it a thought? Is it an emotion? Is it a feeling versus a sensation? Is it an instinct? Is it sexual? We talked a little bit about how the intellectual center works. Intellectual conclusions are always the result of a comparison of two or more impressions. For example, is that a good car? Well, it's better than this car, and it's worse than that car. Or it's cheaper than this car, and it's more expensive than that car. Everything in the mind is comparing things. That's why the mind is dangerous, why we want to talk about the mind, because the only thing that it can compare is the impressions that it's received. It can't compare impressions it hasn't received, which means it can only work with data that it has. So when we're investigating things and we're starting off of our experience, which may be very sheltered or very blocked from the subject that we're studying, could even be ourselves, then we find that the intellect is restricted. It's very restricted. So we need to work with what's called interior mind. We need to open the mind. We need to learn how to quiet the mind through meditation, through esoteric and occult practices, so that we can get out of the mind, because then we can access a lot of information, very, very useful information, specifically useful to the question that we're asking or that we're trying to resolve within ourselves. So the way that we have to distinguish between a thought, a feeling, a sensation, instinctive and movement or sexual sensations and the like is through our own individual experience. It's not something that someone else can define for us. We have to define it through our experience because it's an inner perception. Self-observation is something that only we can do for ourselves by observing internally. So it makes sense that if I want to distinguish between a thought and a feeling, that's a distinction that only I can make through an inner flavor or inner taste, an inner perception. But often what happens is that people confuse thinking and feeling. We mentioned this before. Sometimes people say, I don't feel like this is a good idea. What they mean is they don't think it's a good idea. Or they say, I don't think this is a good idea, and they mean they don't feel like it's a good idea. People are not aware enough of their interior world to be able to distinguish. And if we're working to become esotericists, if we're working to know ourselves, then we need to become familiar with our interior world. And we need to be able to distinguish between the different functions of our interior world. And as we become more familiar, we discover what's called the right and wrong working of the functions, or the right and wrong working of the centers, or the correct and incorrect functioning of the centers at the same time within us. What does that mean? That we see that our thinking center thinks correctly sometimes, in that it does its job of thinking properly. Not that it maybe thinks the way other people think, that's irrelevant. In this case, for what we're studying, what we're talking about is, does it do its job of thinking? Does it function? Does the thinking center function properly? Does the emotional center function properly? Because there is what's called wrong working of the centers. What happens is that, let's say we've been studying for a test in school, or doing a lot of physical labor. At some point the body gets tired. The physical body gets tired of the labor. The intellectual center gets tired of the thinking. And then the energy, the resource of those centers, the motor center and the intellectual center, run out. And so those centers need a break in order for them to recuperate. But if they don't get that break, then there is a possibility of them continuing to work, and that's done through them stealing energy from another center. This is set up as sort of a backup mechanism. Energy can be stolen from another center. And when that happens, it's usually the sexual center that gets its energy stolen from. And when the sexual center's energy is used, that means the sexual center doesn't have the same energy that it needs to function. As a result, later on, it's not going to function as well as it should. It won't have all the energy, the fuel that it had before, and so it won't be able to function properly when it's time to work. The other action that occurs is that there's the sexual center, its energy is very volatile, it's very strong, very powerful. And so when the intellect steals it, or the motor center steals it, it's not, those centers aren't used to that volatility, that powerful energy. And so there becomes excess energy that can't be used, which manifests as useless excitement. If you remember the fans of the Beatles and Elvis, if you've ever seen those videos, those are examples of where the person gets so excited because they're stealing, the energy is being stolen from their sexual center in their emotional center. And this can happen in anything. It often happens when we're teenagers, when we're hanging out with with people that we're attracted to. But it can happen when we're adults too. So the point is, we have to realize when we start to observe ourselves that we'll discover, when we're observing our centers, the right functioning and the wrong working or incorrect functioning of the centers. We'll talk more about that in the final class. When we have the wrong working of the centers, we create an imbalance, a deficit, and this usually creates a lot of psychological imbalance, people feeling neurotic, a lot of busy work and feeling like a bunch of stuff has to get done, but the quality of the work or the result of the work is never actually getting to where we need to go, or serving the big picture purpose. And one of the ways that we can understand the wrong working of the centers is what's called fantasy or daydreaming. Usually this is something that the intellectual center does because it has a power of visualization related with the mind. What happens is if the emotional center doesn't want to do its work, it may ask the intellectual center to daydream about something that it's obsessed with, or that it won't let go of, or that it's kind of fascinated by. The motor center, the sexual center can do the same thing, but in general, they can all ask the intellectual center to do it. But let's understand that daydreaming is the opposite of useful mental activity, because it's not ever directed towards a definite aim or something that's being undertaken to obtain a definite result. It's just going wherever. It's wherever the ego takes it. And so it's another example of the ego dominating the human machine and us wasting time and energy. And of course, this means also if we analyze our dreams, not just our daydreams, but our dreams, we can find the roots of the wrong working of the center. In chapter 16 of a book called Secret Doctrine of Anahuac, it says, the question of the erroneous functioning of the centers, right, which means the incorrect or wrong working of the centers, is a topic that demands a lifetime of study by way of the observation of oneself in action, right, self-observation, and of the rigorous examination of dreams. It's not possible to achieve the comprehension of the centers and their correct or incorrect function in an instant. We need infinite patience. All of life unfolds as a function of the centers and is controlled by them. Our thoughts, ideas, feelings, hopes, fears, loves, hatred, deeds, sensations, pleasures, satisfactions, frustrations, etc. are found in the centers. The discovery of some inhuman element in any of the centers must be the strongest motive for the esoteric work. Any psychological defect must be previously comprehended by means of the technique of meditation before proceeding to its elimination. So we also talked about how to assist the correct working of the centers through the motor center, through exercising outdoors, long walks in the fresh air, swimming, manual labor, mechanics, driving cars, riding bikes, riding horses. The emotional center, listening to good quality music like Beethoven, Mozart, Liszt, and learning how to paint, learning how to do art. Intellectual center can be developed through the study of botany, astrology, medicine, or with the study of esotericism. The motor instinctive centers, the sexual center works harmoniously through transmutation. We learn how to do some transmutation exercises, which we talk about on the days when we do meditation. So let's jump into today's class, which is about the mind. We want to start studying the functioning of the mind. When we study negative emotions, we'll learn that they're often the result of not wanting to cooperate with the inevitable. Because in life, we have to learn to cooperate with the inevitable. And our mind does the same thing in order to justify its subjective thinking. It tries to justify thinking a certain way, even if it's completely against what is inevitably going to happen. When we come to this world, we have 3% of consciousness and 97%, which can be distributed among subconsciousness, infraconsciousness, and unconsciousness. The 3% of awakened consciousness can be increased as we work upon ourselves. It is not possible to increase consciousness by exclusively physical or mechanical procedures. The consciousness can only be awakened through conscious works and voluntary suffering. Various types of energy exist within us, and we should understand the esoteric classifications for them. The first is mechanical energy related with the physical world. The second is vital or etheric energy related with the etheric world. Third is psychic energy related with the astral world. The fourth is mental energy related with the mental world. The fifth is energy of the will related with the causal world and the human soul. Sixth is the energy of the consciousness related with the Buddhic world and the spiritual soul. And seventh, the energy of pure spirit related with the world of Atman, the inner being. No matter how much the mechanical energy, the vital forces within our own organism, the psychic energy, or the mental energy is increased, we will never achieve the awakening of the diverse functions of the consciousness. By itself, the strength of will, even if it is multiplied infinitely, can never achieve the awakening of the consciousness. All these types of energy are divided into different levels and dimensions, which have nothing to do with consciousness. Consciousness can only be awakened through upright efforts. The small percentage of consciousness which humanity possesses, instead of being increased, is usually foolishly wasted in life. It is obvious that by identifying ourselves with all the events of our existence, we uselessly waste the energy of the consciousness. We should see life as a film, without ever identifying with any comedy, drama, or tragedy, and in doing so we will save conscious energy. Consciousness in itself is a type of energy with a very high vibratory affinity. We should not confuse consciousness with memory, since they are as different from one another as the light of the car's headlights are with the road upon which we drive. Many acts take place within ourselves with no participation whatsoever of the consciousness. Many adjustments and readjustments take place within our organism without the consciousness taking part in them. The motor center of our body can drive a car or direct the fingers, which play the piano keys, without even the most insignificant participation of our consciousness. Consciousness is the light which the unconsciousness does not perceive. A blind person cannot perceive physical solar light either. However, it does exist in itself. We need to open ourselves up to the light of the consciousness in order to penetrate into the terrible darkness of the myself, of oneself. Now we will understand better the meaning of John's words when he said in the Gospel, "The light shines in the darkness, but the darkness understandeth it not." It would be impossible, however, for the light of the consciousness to penetrate within the darkness of the self if we do not use the marvelous sense of psychological self-observation. We need to make way for the light to illuminate the tenebrous depths of the eye of psychology. We would never observe ourselves if we did not have an interest in changing, and such an interest is possible only when we truly love the esoteric teachings. An awakened consciousness allows us to experience reality directly. Unfortunately, the intellectual animal mistakenly called a human being, fascinated by the path of subjective logic, has forgotten about the path of the consciousness. Consciousness allows us to experience the reality of any phenomenon in itself and by itself. The reality as opposed to our mental concept of the thing, place, person, being, etc. Natural phenomena in no way coincide exactly with concepts formulated by the mind. Life develops from instant to instant, and when we capture it in order to analyze it, we cause its death. When observing this or that natural phenomenon, normally we try to infer concepts. In doing so, we stop perceiving the reality of the phenomenon, and we only see in it the reflection of theories and stale concepts which have nothing at all to do with the observed fact. If the intellectual hallucination fascinates us, then we want all natural phenomena to coincide with our subjective concepts, and understanding to coincide with our subjective logic. The path of the consciousness is based on lived experiences and not on mere subjective rationalism. All of nature's laws exist within ourselves, and if we do not discover them in our interior, then we will never discover them outside of ourselves. The human being is contained in the universe, and the universe is contained in the human being. What we experience within ourselves is real, because only the consciousness can experience reality. The language of the consciousness is symbolic, intimate, profoundly significant, and only those who are awake can understand it. Whosoever wants to awaken the consciousness must eliminate all the undesirable elements which constitute the ego, the I, the myself, from within. Because the essence, the consciousness, is bottled therein. So clearly we need to get out of the mind. This is what it's trying to explain to us, the subjective mind. So let's look at the mind and the problems that it can cause us. This is part 2. We're going to look at negative thoughts. To think deep and with full attention in our times is unusual. Different thoughts surge from the intellectual center, not from a permanent I or ego, but from the different I's in each of us. When a person has a thought, they affirm and they firmly believe that they are the ones who is thinking. However, through self-observation, we can realize that the multiple thoughts that cross our mind have their origin in the different I's or egos which we carry within. This signifies that we are not true thinking individuals. Indeed, we do not yet have an individual mind. What actually happens is that each one of these different I's or egos that we carry within utilizes the intellectual center. At any time and as often as possible, each of them utilizes the intellectual center in order to think. Therefore, to identify ourselves with this or that negative or harmful thought, believing it to be our own particular property, is absurd. Obviously, this or that negative thought comes from an I or an ego that in a given moment has abusively used our intellectual center. Different types of negative thoughts exist, namely suspicion, distrust, ill will towards another person, passionate jealousy, religious jealousy, political jealousy, family or friendship jealousies, covetousness, lust, revenge, anger, pride, envy, hatred, resentment, theft, adultery, laziness, gluttony, etc. Since it is impossible for an effect to exist without a cause, we can say that a thought could never exist by itself, by spontaneous generation. The relationship between the thinker and the thought is obvious. Each negative thought has its own origin in a different thinker. Many negative thinkers exist within each one of us. Examining this subject matter from the angle of thinkers and thoughts, it is understood then that each one of the I's or egos that we carry within is certainly a different thinker. Nonetheless, each one of these inner thinkers believes itself to be the whole at any given moment. It may be difficult to accept the idea or the thesis of the plurality of thinkers because of our perspective of ourselves, because our perspective would have to totally, dramatically change. How can we accept the idea that we do not possess an individual mind? Well, through self-observation, we can see this for ourselves. The one who does not live in a state of alert novelty, alert perception, who thinks that they're thinking, easily becomes identified with any negative thought. And as an outcome of this behavior, they strengthen the disastrous power of that negative I or ego who is the author of the corresponding thought. The more we identify ourselves with a negative thought, the more we shall be slaves of the corresponding I or ego that characterizes it. Those quarrelsome and negative I's easily take control of certain mental films which are stored in our intellectual center and create harmful thoughts from them. This is a really important concept. We know that we have memories in the different brains, in the three brains, right? In the intellect, emotions, motor, instinctive, sexual. But here it's explaining that the egos take advantage of those memories, which are also called mental films, in order to create harmful thoughts from them. And that, remember, those memories are impressions that we discussed before. If we accept those thoughts, those negative I's, which at a given moment control our intellectual center, we will then be incapable of freeing ourselves from their influence. We must never forget that any negative I deceives itself. It self-deceives and betrays itself and others. In conclusion, it lies. The negative I of jealousy deceives those beings who adore each other and destroys their happiness. The negative I of mystical pride deceives the devotees of the path. Thus, believing themselves to be wise, they walk away from the esoteric work. The negative I appeals to our personal experiences, our memories, our best wishes, our sincerity. This negative I presents something under a false light, something that fascinates us, and the outcome is failure. So when one discovers that negative I or ego in action, when one has learned to live in a state of alertness, then such a deception becomes impossible. So what does this mean? We have to learn to not identify with negative thoughts and thoughts in general. We remind you again that people take this thing called oneself for granted. They also take it not only as one thing, but allow it to say I to everything it does or thinks or feels. When you are first taught about self-observation, you're told to try to observe the work of the different centers so as to see the three people in you corresponding to the three brains: intellect, emotion, action. Let us note that opinions and thoughts belong to the intellectual center. A person usually identifies themselves completely with their opinions, which are borrowed from others, from the news, from movies, television, podcasts, the internet, etc. And this brings us to the subject of identifying with our own thoughts. Our thoughts are not visible to other people, nor are they visible to ourselves, but they are quite definite things composed of definite substances. We can be more or less conscious of our thoughts. Note that when you observe a thought, you're not identified with it. What does this mean? It means that unless you observe the intellectual center and what is going on in it, you tend to take its activity for granted. You will believe your thoughts or take them for granted. You identify with them. You give them quality of truth and either say, I think, or more internally, you take the thoughts as you, as yourself. Then they have the power over you and exert their influence upon you. An unpleasant thought, a dreary, heavy thought, a suspicious thought or a pessimistic thought, an evil thought, and so on, all these thoughts become you, and so you are them through identifying with them. But you are not your thoughts. Any thought can enter the mind. All sorts of hopeless, bad, useless, stupid, formless, and imbecile thoughts can enter the mind. And if you say I to all of them, then where will you be? You will say yes to all of them. You will consent to them. You will, in short, be identified with them, because all the time you will be saying I to them, and believe that I is thinking them, and that they are your thoughts. But as we have said, any thoughts can enter the mind, just as any people can come into your house. Very few of our thoughts are worth following, and in order to begin to think rightly, nearly all the thoughts that casually come into the mind have to be rejected as useless or worse. A man may indeed have very dangerous thoughts, especially when he accepts them as if they were his own. He is so naive as to believe that all thoughts coming into his mind are his own and that he himself thought them, and so he says I to them, not knowing any better. But if he begins to understand that he must observe his thoughts, then he will soon have quite a different viewpoint. So clearly this means we need a new way of thinking and of understanding our thoughts. Many authors on religions, want to discuss doctrine and the letter of the law. They indulge in all sorts of hair-splitting arguments. But sometimes, in some Christian books, a writer says very insightful things like, people must remember that the devil sends many thoughts into our minds and that we must never think that they are our own thoughts. Explaining the idea at some length, And one author often emphasized the phrase, "Our thoughts are not our own." This same writer said that we are not responsible for our thoughts, but responsible for our thinking. Just as a side note, there's an interesting book by C.S. Lewis called The Screwtape Letters. Screwtape, all one word. Screwtape Letters. Very good book about two demons that are working to corrupt a human, and they're discussing how to do it, the methodology. It's similar concepts as to what is being discussed here by Maurice Nicoll. This is extracts from Maurice Nicoll's lectures. He was a student of Gurdjieff and Ouspensky. Note that you can think a thought or not. A thought enters the mind and seeks to attract you. If it does, then you begin to think it. That is, to think from it. You begin to enlarge this thought by paying attention to it and thinking from it until it grows in all directions and forms something like a little tree of thought in you that bears fruit and seeds other similar thoughts. This is quite clear in the case of suspicious thoughts. Please understand that a thought and thinking are not the same. Let us suppose that the thought enters your mind that Mr. X is lying. This is only a thought. You probably say to yourself, "I must think about it." But if you believe the thought, then at once you identify with it. Your thought has now transformed Mr. X into a liar. What thoughts we identify with change things very much. For instance, some people habitually identify with gloomy, torturous, mistrustful class of thoughts. They like thoughts of this shape and color, so they accept such thoughts and reject others. These thoughts alter things for them, like dark glasses do to one's vision. Now they are identified with these thoughts in such a way that they cannot see them. They are these thoughts, so they cannot observe them and see that they are certain kinds of thoughts and that there are sorts of other thoughts that exist as well, with different shapes and colors. A person can have any kind of thoughts. Any thoughts can come into a person. In the Gospels, it is pointed out that it is not what comes into a man that defiles him, but what comes out of a man. Any sort of thought can enter the mind, but whether you identify with it and act from it, or rather react, is another question. If you identify with a thought, then you say "I" to it, and you believe it. So you will think from it or act from it. How do you think? How do you act? How you think and how you act is what comes out of you. It's an interesting sentence. How you think and how you act is what comes out of you. The thought that enters the mind is what goes into a person. What a person thinks and does from this thought is what comes out of that person. A thought that is a lie, a wrong thought, wrongly joined together, a false thought, a depressing thought, a thought that takes hold of one thing and ignores everything else, or that kind of thought that can only deny and contradict, etc. If a person identifies with such thoughts, then they will think and act from them. That person's mind will be a mess. The ideas of this work are to build the mind up in the right order so that everything can be related properly. In the center of the mind stands the ray of creation. This is the scale of being. From the highest to the lowest, all things fall into their place. But unless the mind is changed by the work, it continues to think that all its thoughts are real and true. The mind is then like a tent lying in a heap on the ground, without a central upright pole. All its parts are touching together, but touching each other wrongly. They are not stretched out. By means of the training of the work and learning to think from what it teaches, a person begins to be able to distinguish between right and wrong thinking. One begins to learn how to think in the right scale and how not to mix scales and so on. All this helps a person not to identify with all their thoughts. It gives a center of gravity to their thinking. Learning a new way of thinking. This work is to make a person think properly. That is why it is so important to try to take it in what this work teaches. I don't understand that sentence. Let me reread it. That is why it is so important to try to take in what this work teaches. That is why it is so important to try and take in what this work teaches. If you are learning chemistry, for example, or a foreign language, you know that it is very important to listen to what you are taught and to arrange it in your mind properly and to think about it, to think about what you're being taught. Yet many people never think of what they are being taught. But in the work, the Gnostic esoteric work, it is necessary to do so. Why is it necessary? Because it builds upon a new system of thought and of thinking in your minds. Actually, it makes your mind begin to work in the right way so that it can really begin to think. Now let us emphasize that a thought and thinking a thought are not the same. A thought may enter your mind, but you may or may not think it. And even if you think it, you need not necessarily identify with it. But there are many different kinds of thoughts, higher and lower, big and little, that enter the mind, and this belongs to a later teaching. What is necessary to realize at present is that thoughts of every kind are possible, and that they are not yours, and that you make them yours by identifying with them. And if this is so, then you can be pulled in any direction, because these thoughts can pull you anywhere. There is a science of thought. This work, with all its ideas and teaching and instructions, has to do with the right science of thought and thinking. And for that reason, all of you who have heard the work for some years should know what it means to find fault with your own thoughts and your own thinking, and should be able to see wrong thoughts and inadequate and unrelated thinking, poor thoughts, negative thoughts, useless thoughts, lying thoughts, and so on. The first change demanded in this work, as in the Gospels, is a change of mind, called metanoia in Greek, which is often translated as repentance. But for change of mind to take place, you must begin to think from this work and what it teaches. Then later, perhaps, you can begin to act from the work. But first of all, a new way of thinking is necessary. The work says that any thought or thoughts can enter your minds, and they are not your thoughts. It says you can think them or not, and it says that you can identify with them or not. When you hear this as part of the teaching of the work and apply it by observing yourself in the intellectual center, then you will see that it is quite true. When you realize this, you will begin thinking in a new way about yourself. If you can realize practically, that is, by experience, that you can be passive to your own thoughts by not identifying with them, then you will have already reached a definite stage of work on the intellectual center. But if you take yourself as one, then you will never get to this point. You will remain stuck in the illusion that all your thoughts, feelings, and moods are you, or rather, I myself. You will have no insight into the enormous inner world of height and depth, containing thousands of inhabitants, good and bad, that you take for granted as one person, which you regard as yourself in the customary state of sleep, and say I to at every moment. Everything that takes place in yourself, you will call I. You will never move from this position. Excuse me. So you will never move from this position you are in because you take yourself as one. And so you will never understand what it means to become passive to yourself. We're talking about practical work that leads to becoming passive to thoughts. This belongs to intimate work on the intellectual center. This subject about long practical work on non-identifying with thoughts is what we've been talking about. So that's the end of the material for today. Again, the important idea is to not accept or reject thoughts, but certainly to not take them as ourselves, that to see them as thoughts when we're observing the intellectual center. We'll talk more about the mind and how to work against the mind in the next phase. But first, we just want to understand that we don't need to accept thoughts as us. We're not thoughts. We're in essence, we're the spark of divinity, inhabiting an organism, a human organism, for a few years or a few moments, whatever it may be, on this planet, who has an opportunity. And we have this human organism that has the three brains, the different centers, and so we need to study them so that we can learn how to use this machine optimally. How does it work? So we start to observe in order to gather the data so that we can understand how to be efficient and take great use or great advantage of this machine. So we don't need to accept thoughts as our own, as ourselves. They are occurring inside of us, and we said that there can't be a cause without an effect, which means someone is thinking them. But since we know that we contain many egos, many desires, many eyes, then it's logical that those eyes are the ones who are thinking. They're using the intellectual center to think. And therefore, we don't need to accept them as ourselves, as who we are. So if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to leave them at this time in the comment area. We want to thank you for your attention. And we want to, we're going to try and do a meditation tomorrow night. We weren't able to do it last Friday, but we're going to try and do one tomorrow night. And then otherwise we are going to go on break until the 6th of January, Epiphany, I believe that is. And we'll do something on that day. So when we'll be back. Well, doesn't look like there's any questions or comments at this time, but we do want to thank you guys again for your attention, for deciding to spend the time with us, because it's not always easy to make that effort. And so we wish you the best in your esoteric work, and a happy holiday season. A very magical time of year esoterically right now, especially in the next coming days with the winter solstice, the birth of the symbolic birth of the Christ, New Year, and then the Epiphany, the time when the three magi, the magicians, came to give their gifts to the Christ. Beautiful time of year, so we want to invite you to reflect during this time. Take advantage, hopefully, of a little bit of time off. But again, thank you so much for your attention, and we wish you the best.